We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarron.
And this is Jeremy Rothe Kushel.
All right, we're back here on the 19th of November with a post-American midterm elections political roundup, and we'll discuss what we're paying attention to as far as the political and otherwise related implications of the 2022 midterm elections here in the States, and some of the dynamics that are going on, including Democratic leadership, this very interesting drama that's unfolding over the future of Donald Trump, who is just, of course, earlier this week announced that he has officially made his announcement that he's going to be running for president again in 2024, and some of the dynamics going on there with people abandoning ship from Trump, and this decision I think that's going to have to be made at some point between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. We're going to get into discussing that, and then even that as it relates to, and then I think later on we'll get into some of this continuing drama surrounding the ongoing stuff with the former Kanye West and bringing in Dave Chappelle and Jon Stewart into the conversation. And then I think also we're going to have some follow-up discussion on topic of Whitney Webb that we discussed on our previous show. But for now, we're going to start out with just a kind of a bit of an antidote, general political landscape of the aftermath of our midterms here in the States and the red wave, the red tsunami that was supposed to take place, that all of the political pundits had said was going to happen, and then it turned out not to happen, Jeremy. So that's an interesting development. Of course, you've identified some of the types of people that were pushing the red wave, and it's all very interesting. But we did not get that, and so right now we're in a situation where we've got a new generation of Democratic leadership. It looks like Nancy Pelosi and maybe Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn are stepping aside for the next generation. But who exactly is that next generation? And what's going on with the Republicans and Donald Trump and Ron DeSanctimonious, as he calls him, for daring to consider a presidential run, I guess, and all of the drama going on there. So we'll try to get into some of this stuff here. I guess I'll start out by asking you, Jeremy, what are some of your feelings, general feelings, coming out of the American midterm elections, the state of our politics, and then and some of the bigger effects of it, and then we'll get into some of these more specific topics here, I guess. But it's good to be back with you, and let's get into it.
Good to be back with you too, Greg. And I think the first thing I'd like to start with is the question of the narrative framing and the apparent propaganda and psychological warfare that surrounded the predictions of the coming red wave. And, in my gut, I had suspicions about the range of the polling that continued to reinforce these narratives of like everywhere from, straight up Russian state media, like fault lines in the morning. They were sort of celebrating, even like what's meant to be like their progressive Jamal Thomas. He was celebrating that the Democrats needed to be taught a lesson, right, Craig? Something in that realm, and that it was coming for sure. And they had multiple guests, including good old Schlafly acolyte Ed Martin on there maybe multiple times in the run up to the midterms.
You were mentioning Mark Sloboda, the Russian, American-born, now Russian citizen, and commentator Mark Sloboda, who made a reference to potential manipulation of oil prices by Saudi Arabia to punish American Democrats, and Jamal Thomas has this big grin on his face, and he just thought that was wonderful and funny that was brought up. That's what you were referring to, this idea of the Democrats being punished by Saudi Arabia, and the realism of Mohammed bin Salman. He's just realistically looking to Russia and China to get away from the crumbling empire. That's how Mark Sloboda puts it. But the geopolitical realist MBS might be manipulating oil prices to punish Democrats in the elections, and that was just something that Jamal Thomas found to be very funny and uh, and a great thing, I guess.
Well, yes, and that's another piece about that's the geopolitics that they were reacting to in the weeks up to the midterm elections. And that's its own thing, which is very intriguing because what that actually points to is exactly what we've been saying, even on their airwaves, about maybe you guys should look at Seth Abramson's work on the Red Sea conspiracy about actual Trump Russia collusion. It didn't just stop there, but it involved Mohammed bin Zayed, Bibi Netanyahu, all up in the mix there. And so to this day, they continue to say it was all a conspiracy theory, Trump Russia, there was nothing there. And then meanwhile, the geopolitics of this are playing out in a way that Jamal is, embracing and celebrating in the way that you're talking about it. And it may have been, maybe it was Manila Chan who was the one who was more celebrating, but I think that I think I heard Jamal Thomas also celebrating the predictions of the red wave and the teaching the Democrats a lesson during the midterms. And it didn't turn out that way for them. But everywhere from them to Tim Pool, who was really they were really pushing that this was coming, but on even to like to the Jimmy Dore types and all of them. And one of the things we focused on here, especially in terms of our analysis of the 11/9 operation and who actually the networks that actually helped install Trump. When you go look to the origins in the Arthur Finkelstein network, is we pointed out that a lot of these guys basically are the Finky's kids, the proteges, the political dirty op proteges of Arthur Finkelstein. They basically break up into either pollsters, also known as public relations people, but pollsters, someone like a Frank Luntz or a John McLaughlin, or they then break off into the actual political operative type that Finkelstein himself really was, someone in the mold of a Roger Stone, someone like that. And these pollsters are not actually pollsters. And that was one thing that we keep on pointing out. This is not some kind of statistical science operation going on here. There's some information gathering for interests of the campaigns. But the main thing that seems to be done via these polling, and in this case, in terms of 2022, it looks like virtually all of the polls that were being pointed to about across the board in terms of the coming red wave were very likely manipulative. They weren't just off. They weren't just off. They were manipulative political operations. And so, as we've always pointed out about the role of Frank Luntz is seen as just polling people. But remember what he actually did. He helped lead the way, hired by Les Wexner, Epstein's patron, partner, part of elder deep statesman in the Epstein Maxwell network. Ultimately, that Wexner hired Frank Luntz, this alleged just GOP pollster who gets on TV and does polls his TV selected audience about certain phrases and things like that. That Wexner hired Luntz specifically to do a write up about how to pitch, how to public relations, smear the public relations on the Iraq War, to be able to frame it as in American interests and not about Israeli interests. All right. So that's a key thing here. I think we need to understand that the polling aspect is deeply weaponized. It is a part of the political warfare apparatus. It is not related to actual statistics or assessing the truth, uh, and all of that. And so that really should be held to account, I think, maybe first and foremost in terms of the way that the actual electoral political landscape, the perception of it, and the narrative surrounding it uh, is shaped, because that did not happen, and there's very little mea culpa. So now there's beginning to turn a little bit in terms of what you described about a potential GOP political civil war between Trump and DeSantis, or between Trump and everybody else, who, they're really trying to push the GOP folks to say whether they support or deny Trump the right to run as their candidate in 2024. So a lot now is going to be made of that in order to avoid the much more rubber meeting the road, eternal political operations of the weaponized pollsters, who are replete throughout both the political sphere and the media sphere in all of this. So, now it seems to have shaken out that the Republicans will take the House by maybe a seat or two or something like that. But it looks like the Democrats have held the Senate, and whatever the red wave turned out to be, you know, basically someone throwing paint on a painting.
Yeah, it's interesting when you get into this whole I don't know if you had much else you wanted to say about the pollsters and the red tsunami coming along. It's interesting with you mentioned Frank Luntz, and I guess that's what he specializes in, is like this whole idea of talking to people. And and like the when I was in Amway, Frank Luntz came and spoke to a conference that I attended, and it was all about using words that win with people. And it's basically like a, I guess, it's a version of like this type of what you described with the Iraq War and the Wexner analysis that Luntz did for the for people that are involved in multi-level marketing, and ways to use words and terms that could win the support of the people that maybe you're trying to court to get into your business or whatnot. But it works on the level of politics, and that's basically like Luntz is like a he's like a PR man for these various causes, almost masquerading as like this political pundit, I think, in a lot of ways, or this political pollster who's the expert, who has the this all this expert information on what people are going to do and how they're going to vote and all this. But I think really it's much more, and this is probably the case with a lot of these people. It's much more PR ultimately, in terms of basically being public relations for these varying causes, whether it's the Amway, which is the corporation, the organization of the DeVos, Van Andel, GOP Council for National Policy dynasty in Michigan, or whether it's big time, big league foreign policy decisions, such as skidding the almost paving the way for the elements of the PR narrative justifications for why going to war in Iraq would be a good thing for the United States, rather than for the country, on behalf of where there was a lot of lobbying for the war in Iraq seems a good thing, and that would be for the nation of Israel. And that's how Luntz seems to operate. And that's my personal experience with him. And I'd imagine it's a similar dynamic going on with a lot of this, especially when you think about it's all PR background getting into like there's a lot of PR obviously there with the New York machine of a lot, where a lot of these types of Finkelstein, Tony Fabrizio types come out of there. But I can use my personal analogy with Luntz of like this is a lot of PR masquerading in a lot of ways as like being the expert voice on how the people are going to vote based on we got the focus group together, here's how this is going to go and here's how that's going to go. And like it's really, I think a lot of that ultimately is public relations on behalf of very powerful interests, and then that's turned into here's the expert that's going to say how things are going to go. I think that that's a big part of the dynamic that you got going on with people like Frank Luntz and his ilk.
Definitely, definitely. And I sort of want to get into like a little potential clip here from a little text clip from Proof of Conspiracy that talks about one of these Finkelstein pollsters where the actual nature of the involvement in the 11/9 operation in Trump Russia was about sharing polling data. And we're talking about Tony Fabrizio, who, by the way, was recently once again at the Dole Institute here on the KU campus in Lawrence, Kansas. We pointed out, we did a whole show really after the passing away of Robert Dole, and in addition to many other mentions at other shows about this very, very interesting and very tight relationship of the Dole network, actually, and some of the Kansas political network with the networks that then helped install Trump. And Fabrizio was at one of these events in the run up to the midterms this year at the Dole Institute, and I was not able to make it, but I don't believe there were any questions about uh, his role in the 11/9 operation. So. If we could, I would like to get into just a little bit of the background here because it also mentions Tom Barak, which we haven't mentioned that Barack actually had his trial where he was indicted, I think, on nine different counts of being an agent, for an unregistered foreign agent of the United Arab Emirates, specifically in relationship to the 2016 election and the Trump administration. And all of that, and he was found not guilty on all nine counts, and it sort of hasn't been talked about much. So that's one past thing that we've mentioned that was happening that we didn't point to the resolution. Another thing that maybe we'll get to a little bit later here is that Tulsi Gabbard, after we discussed her coming out, leaving the Democratic Party, she has now found her paid role as a contributor, a paid contributor at Fox News. What a surprise that is. We've also had now um, things like Whitney Webb begin to respond to her appearance on the Glenn Beck show. Now, especially since the follow up guest on his podcast was Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And in the wake of us beginning to discuss the preemptive, I would say, interview before that should be looked at hand in hand politically with her Glenn Beck interview, was her Patrick Ben David interview on the PBD, I think, podcast. It's not called Valuetainment. It's a PBD podcast. And you can sort of begin to, it doesn't mean that you're guilty necessarily of by association, or you're guilty by going on a platform necessarily. But when you then on two separate occasions, virtually the same exact political weapon is deployed in the run up to these midterms, where the red wave is being predicted, where there's a strong hype in these exact podcast circles of supporting these Trump backed MAGA candidates is coming up, that the same exact political weapon is deployed about running cover for Trump and Epstein, and how there is a very credible, and more than just one, but just the tip of the iceberg, very credible rape allegations against Trump and Epstein by a young girl. And that it's not just money in the case of what Whitney Webb increasingly begins to sound like a sort of Catherine Austin Fitts type of character, who really, like folks who know about the 9/11 truth movement, have a sense of Catherine Austin Fitts always contributed a good bit in terms of, black politics, black money, that kind of stuff, but also seemed to never really get to the heart of the matter of who did it and why. It was just sort of follow the money, follow the money. You can follow the money endlessly into a spiral of a black hole. It doesn't really necessarily lead you to the rubber meeting the road of hard who and why politics, which the Epstein Maxwell operation, yes, money is a key piece of it. Money laundering, black money, of course, the intersection of the national security apparatus, covert operations, and the underworld organized criminal economy. Sure. But in terms of the highest level of reason, of motive, of why, you have to come back to the compromat. The compromat situation. Why is this being leveraged? Why is these cameras? Why are these cameras that are all around the Epstein properties there to film these heavy hitters, these billionaires, these politicians, these once presidents, these eventual presidents? And what does it mean about the actual leverage there? So now is all left out in both of these major appearances by Whitney Webb, and so some of that has begun to take hold. John Brisson on We've Read the Documents, who just actually recently had his entire YouTube channel wiped out. One of the last things that he actually had done was a very good critical take on Whitney Webb's appearance on Glenn Beck. Sebs from formerly of Doom and Gloom, now I think Doom's Dungeon. She did a long form investigation of Whitney Webb's appearance on Glenn Beck. Whitney Webb has actually apparently even responded to you, Greg, a little bit on Twitter and others on Twitter, and seems to really miss the point or try to avoid the actual critical questions here about the deep politics of all of this by saying, well, people need to pay for and read her entire book before they can make commentary. No. Meanwhile, some of us who were talking on these issues publicly, doing public analysis, doing some amount of public interest investigations on these matters before you even took it up, Whitney, we're going to continue talking about this, and we're going to continue talking, about critical matters, especially in terms of these key timings, these big, very suspicious platforms, and what's going on with that. Now, I don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't never do it. I don't do it with anyone, whether I'm being critical of the way that maybe Brendan O'Connell has certain things that he said or attacked people in certain ways, including us, in ways that were deceptive and lies and unfair. You don't then just throw out everybody's research, alongside of that. So, sh and it's the same way that I have with Whitney Webb. She has done important research, and I'll bet there's a lot of important information in her 1,000 pages of writing, just as there's a lot of important information in the 1,000 pages of Brendan O'Connell's write up about his analysis and his history in his UN document. Okay, that does not now all of that does not then firewall them from proper, legitimate criticisms of what it looks to me like the kind of political operations that they actually end up running. And actually, at some level, I begin to see a little bit of a very strange kind of horseshoe between Brendan O'Connell, what Brendan O'Connell has been doing in sort of cultivating the Bannon Trump power or something like that, or the grassroots or something like that, while apparently not having actually studied any of the actual investigations that, for example, we've done here at the Antidote over more than 5 years in terms of actual Trump Russia and how it actually works its way out. And then a horseshoe back with someone like Whitney Webb, who's also Brendan's arch nemesis in some ways. And the commonality here seems to be running some kind of cover for the Trump operation, which is very, very strange and all of that. But meanwhile, while I deploy those, I think, legitimate criticisms of their actual public spoken words and the actual political consequences of them, and I'd say in many ways aspects of weaponized, wrongful analysis in terms of it, I still would urge people to actually go and take stock of their actual research and work, because in both those cases, but whether it's Brendan or Whitney, they are very good. Both of them are very good researchers. Their analysis a little bit not quite as up to snuff as their research, but I would say go look at their research and meanwhile hold a critical eye to the analysis. So this is a lot of this is being sort of played out since we've last recorded Greg, including the Tulsi move, including the response to Whitney Webb's appearance on Glenn Beck, and then Bibi himself showing up in the immediate wake of that, and all of the political machinations surrounding that. But do you want to say something about this realm before I get into is it okay, Greg, if I get into a little bit of this proof of conspiracy about Barack and it gets into Fabrizio and everything?
That sounds good. I will say something, follow up with you on the whole, on this Webb, Glenn Beck category. And that's just think about this. These were the two featured interviews. Like the Glenn Beck podcast is not just his radio show or whatnot. I mean, these are the featured interviews. And I believe he referred to the interview with Webb as perhaps the most important interview he's ever done.
He did.
And this was just before Benjamin Netanyahu comes on to define the parameters of anti-Semitism and talk about how great, the typical spiel that Netanyahu gives to the American evangelicals that he has for many years now on Glenn Beck's podcast. And that's very interesting that you've got Whitney Webb, who has positioned herself as one of the, in some cases, alternative media, one of the more prominent critics of Israel and of elements of Israel's power. And of course, we could also talk about, there may be another topic for another time, elements of where that might be lacking in some areas. But in terms of the of Israel, she's seen as one of the maybe leading alternative media critics of the state of Israel. And then she's followed up by Benjamin Netanyahu, who credibly, I mean, is in the obviously his fingerprints are all over the roots of the global war on terrorism going back to the late 70s and on. And then, of course, the history we talked about with Netanyahu in September 11th and Netanyahu in the Iraq War, and the dynamics of the relationship the dressing down of American political parties and even presidents in the name of pushing the agenda as far as of Iran and sabotaging the attempting to sabotage the Iran nuclear deal and all this. And then, of course, the Netanyahu-Trump grand bargain, as we call it, the global elements of the 2016 operation with Trump and Israel's primary role and all that under Netanyahu. And, of course, even Glenn Beck, you can go on somebody's program or podcast, and it's not, and that in and of itself is not a sign of something nefarious going on. Obviously, I mean, it's but in the case of Whitney Webb, I get the sense that she has some understanding. She has to have some understanding of Glenn Beck and how he's operated all these years. I mean, Glenn Beck is like he's the, as far as like the neocon commentators who have prominent radio shows and all this, out of the names, he's the religious pusher of Zionism. It's him and you also have Dennis Prager, but as far as like the triumvirate of Beck, Hannity, and Limbaugh from the Bush days, it was Glenn Beck that pushes the religious Zionist angle much more than any of those two have, I think he's the most prominent of them. And for her to go on, and then the prime minister of the state of Israel with I would say the leading conservative neocon media pusher of the religious elements of evangelical Zionism in terms of a political context, Glenn Beck, and then just to fit it into this narrative of this weaponized narrative of the Great Reset and the weaponized COVID narratives and the agenda as far as that goes. I mean, it's a big problem. And real quick, I'll read this tweet here. This is what Whitney Webb responded to in particular. First, there was a person by the name of Jeff. Okay, this is what Whitney Webb wrote. This is a response to Yo Pasta, Craig Pasta Jardula, who is, I believe he's part of the Convo Couch program. He wrote this: to all the children hating on Whitney Webb for taking an interview with Glenn Beck, a person that thinks differently than her. It's called being an adult. You should try it one day because your nonsense is getting old. Go keep it real with your imaginary friends somewhere else. Whitney Webb responds, I wrote a nonpartisan book on Jeffrey Epstein intelligence, and so far only big name, quote, right, end quote, and quote, conservative, end quote, people have wanted to have me on to talk about it. It's not my fault that most big, quote, left, unquote, platforms are uninterested in what I have to say, but it is telling. That response to me, it's very similar to what a Glenn Greenwald will say, that's why I go on Tucker Carlson and out on MSNBC because they don't want me. So that's kind of similar. I mean, still fair. It's But there's a problem with like when you consider like the topics that are not discussed within these platforms, I think becomes a problem there. But that was Whitney Webb's response. Then a Twitter poster by the name of Jeffrey L. Klump wrote, Whitney, there is more to the connections with Epstein and his friend, Epstein Island Trump. The name of the game in Washington is blackmail. My response was, interesting how she gets all of these invites while conveniently leaving out the details about Trump Epstein, also Epstein and RFK Jr. And she's been on panels with Robert Kennedy Jr., which is where and John Brisson focused on that in his video about Whitney Webb and her rather not dealing with that. But anyway, Whitney Webb responded, I discuss both of these angles extensively in the book, which I wish people would take the time to read before shitting on my work. Thanks. And then I wrote, he barely alluded to pictures of Epstein and RFK Jr. on Patrick David's podcast, and I never heard you once reference the name Katie Johnson when it comes to Trump Epstein. You do not, to my knowledge, talk about the historical nature of Trump-Russian mob relationship, and choosing instead to fall back on simply dismissing Russiagate. Then I had a tweet in there about imagine if you had brought this up to Glenn Beck, what his response would have been. So that was, and so the thing, like what you said, Jeremy, is that like if it's in the book, as you said, like within 1,000 pages, there's going to be a lot of very useful information, especially from a good researcher, analyst like Whitney Webb. There's going to be a lot of useful information in it. And if that's in the book, fine. But it's like, how come these things never come up in these very prominent media interviews you do with these agenda pushing, obviously in the case of Glenn Beck, and apparently so in the case of like a Patrick Bet-David, platforms where it's kept very specifically within these parameters of, yeah, there might be a problem with someone like Trump, but really let's focus on Clinton, Epstein, and this weaponized Great Reset narrative. Why does it not come up in any of these places? Like, sure, okay, direct people to your book, but also this stuff never seems to get discussed in these high-profile interviews. Why is that?
That was obviously your point too, and that it was about what she actually says and doesn't say in public, not behind some big, it is a firewall of some sort. I'm not saying like authors shouldn't be paid for their work. They should be paid for their work. I was considering purchasing Whitney Webb's book, or at least a used copy if I could get a copy of it, because first of all, because I know that there is from her actual comprehensive nature of some of her analysis and her articles, especially in relationship to her articles about Paul Singer, uh, some aspects of the startup nation and Israeli technology, and then the deeper background behind the Epstein Maxwell network, deep into the deep state of the United States and how it extends. I know that there is a lot of good information in there, but also in order to critically approach it too. But that doesn't mean that you have to pass through the paywall of purchasing and reading, and also the time wall of reading someone's, in this case, it's 2 books, about 1,000 pages, that you have to refrain from making political public interest commentary critical of her public speech before you do that. That's absurd. And it was clear to me that you were actually pointing that out, Greg, that whether or not whatever she says in her book, that's not the point. The point is, how is it that she gets on these platforms and then doesn't, when she's on these platforms, she doesn't discuss this question of actual Trump compromise in a very specific way. Also, she really weak sauces the whole entire Israeli connection in regards to this. And the part of the point is we know that she knows this stuff. She's even said a lot of this stuff on, like with Tim Dillon. She did an interview with Tim Dillon where she went deep into the Israeli intelligence connections to cyber intrusion, cyber takeover. She goes all through Carbine 911. She goes ahead and just calls Ehud Barak a pedophile. Now, she then uses things about allegations surrounding someone like Trump. She doesn't even mention Ehud Barak in either of the PDB podcasts nor the Glenn Beck. And now what's interesting about it is that you, even within the sort of what people like so-called grown-ups, actually very childish, this Pasto guy, There's virtually nothing of serious intellectual legitimacy there, and it looks just part of the network. We did interviews with the spokesman, and he had their number basically. That whole network, they're fakers. They're part of the Jimmy Dore kind of fake left kind of network that first and foremost seem to be helping cover up for the 11/9 operation. Now, what's interesting too is there seems to be a link to covering up the 9/11 operation. And we know Whitney Webb knows about 9/11, knows that there's some real serious connections to Israel. She wrote up a whole write up about the so called celebrating Israelis and all of that. And so, even in holding to some of this kind of narrative aspect, she could have brought up Ehud Barak in relationship to Epstein in terms of her interview with Glenn Beck, and that would have then played even well in sort of contrast to upcoming Netanyahu and all of that. But that was all left out. All right. And especially the way that she seemed to underplay the Trump Epstein relationship. It's not a minor thing for there to be highly credible with this very specific time and place. A lot of the details of the Katie Johnson allegations seem to are highly legitimate. Now, there's also been serious journalistic follow up by someone like Wayne Madsen about the question of who Maria or Mary was, who was involved, who was was basically seemed to be at the same party where Katie Johnson alleges that she was raped by Trump and Epstein. Wayne Madsen has done a lot of the follow up about this. Now, this is highly legitimate journalism, and this is a very key thing. It's not a minor thing. It just even morally, of course, to Glenn Beck's alleged Christian audience, this is a very important thing for it to be backing and to be running cover for someone who rapes girls. All right. But then, even on top of that, there's the whole rape of the body politic of where the rubber actually meets the road, not in terms of dirty money flows. That's the way that the system is lubricated is via the money. But where the rubber actually meets the road is in terms of high level compromise. Government by compromat. Government by political corruption, where someone is owned, okay? And that's obviously the key piece of the Epstein Maxwell analysis, not just follow the money and all of that, all right? And that was just totally left out. And so, again, the timing of this, going back to our analysis of Ye and Tulsi and the October surprise and all of that, this would have been different if these interviews that she did, that Whitney Webb did with Glenn Beck and Patrick Ben David. By the way, what were the follow ups? Look just to see the context, the guest context of the platform that she was on before that. So you have the truth about Jeffrey Epstein, and that the truth is the only capitalized total all capitalized letters. The truth about Jeffrey Epstein with Whitney Webb, PBD podcast episode 198. Okay. And then you go forward, and then you get to you're talking about Dinesh D'Souza just a few episodes later, urging people to purchase the DVD of the 2,000 Mules, or the 2 Million Drools, as I call it. All right. Then you get on to Rod Blagojevich election day recap, and then the main Bitcoin midterms and Trump episode 204 of the PBD podcast is with the Dave Rubin and the Rubin Report. Okay. And there's a lot of Trump cover up here. All right. And so this is exactly the nature of the politics that Whitney Webb was, I guess, in some way agreeing to participate in. But as I pointed out, this is what she's participated in with her entire media network, really, especially since she's gone from Mint Press News to Last American Vagabond. There is a major, major cover up actual facts of the 11/9 operation, of Trump-Russia collusion, of actual Russian sphere geopolitical information, psychological warfare, all of that kind of stuff, and that goes hand in hand with the horseshoe of the sort of controlled opposition, I would call it, and the sort of the red herring opposition to COVID tyranny, also a red herring away from the actual origins of the COVID operation into basically COVID minimization, or even in certain cases, in terms of Last American Vagabond, of like really like pushing uh virus denial basically as an entire approach. Okay, is the kind of stuff, both COVID killed people and also COVID disinformation killed people. All right. And lockdowns also killed people. All right. So you have to be a sophisticated, not just an either or kind of thinker in order to make your way through these deep state events. COVID, 11/9, 9/11. All right. You got to be able to really not just sort of pick a side. You got to stick with the truth. All right, that's the side we got to be on. All right, so I just wanted to point that out, that this is the context here of why we're making public critical comments about what actually Whitney Webb was doing on these podcasts. It was not the big truth about the Jeffrey Epstein network. It was the politically convenient truth for those networks. Okay, and all right. Well, there's more to say about this moving forward, but I'll leave it there for now.
All right, sounds good. Do we want to get into is it proof of conspiracy you're going to be reading from?
Yes,
Okay.
because the other thing here is part of this that continues to go on, and I more and more believe that this is like a crucial thing, is the cover up of 11/9. By virtually the entire swath here, and then that then goes into then January 6th minimization in many ways, and then that ultimately creates the next kind of vacuum for why someone like Donald Trump could come in and pretend to be some kind of populist outsider there to overthrow the deep state because of lack of accountability by those who were the apparent or alleged opposition to it, whether it's Nancy Pelosi and the DNC political machine, or so called CNN's opposition to Trump, any of that kind of stuff. Okay. So I still think that like the actual facts of 11/9 and Trump Russia collusion, not just, but a key portion of it is crucial. It's obviously still crucial, as the questions around DeSantis and Trump come into frame. The question of Ukraine comes more intensely into frame with the changing Congress and Marjorie Taylor Greene making her, pitch to account for it now. Also with the Sam, what's his name? Sam Bankman Fried, or Fraud, as some people call him. The FTX scandal, bigger than Enron. Really, it's probably twice the amount of global funds that have just sort of collapsed and gone away. And there is a major piece of this. Bankman Fried was the second biggest donor to the Democratic Party in the last cycle to George Soros. Now, there was also a lot of money going to the Republicans. So you begin to see what's his name, Greg? The billionaire who we always like to talk about.
Who are we referring to here? I'm sorry.
The guy who shifted from equally investing in the Republicans and Democrats, and then throwing all into the Republicans for the Trump 11/9 Russia operation. The guy who
Oh
doesn't like
no,
to be called an oligarch.
I'm almost. Oh man, I apologize here. I should have the name on the top of my tongue.
I can't read. We haven't talked about him in a while, but
Yeah, but
bought
but
a lot. Bought the Mnuchin assets after Mnuchin went into the to the White House.
I'll I'll get the name here in a minute, but I just wanted to follow up on that real quick. That there's an interesting discussion on this on the most recent episode of the Gaslit Nation podcast with Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa, where they talk about what they call the illusion, the myth of red and blue states. We have purple states, and in this context, what you're talking about here, I thought about this. We talked about like these big time Democratic donations and all this big money. Is that they particularly focus on New York, where both of them have history in. Both of the hosts of this podcast have history in New York, and without knowing the ins and outs of like New York state politics and all this, I mean, you can look at New York from a distance and kind of see like some of the dynamics that are at play in New York, and this idea of like New York's like this progressive shithole, like Donald Trump would call it, basically, of crime ridden and all this. But when you actually look at it, like what you've got is like you've got these big machine politics. They're not red or blue. They're definitely not blue in terms of like the way like New York City's talked about by like Fox News style media, but it's like it's blue in turn. It's not. It's all basically just big money machine mafia politics, I think, at high levels, like within the New York state system. So I just thought of that because I thought that was their description of like this of the way like these high level political operations work. It seems like in places like New York, and this whole idea of like myth of red and blue, and it's not about it's not about principled red politics or blue politics, especially like in a machine like New York. I just thought of that in the context of what you were saying there, was referring to Bankman-Fried and this big money going, and I feel like that's interrelated to this particular discussion that was had on this Gaslit Nation podcast about the big money machine politics.
Yes, and this maybe this can also play in when we get a chance to really hone in on the media. Now we delved in a little bit to the Whitney Webb appearances. We probably should go into that a little bit more, but there's a bunch of other media analysis that we need to do that includes then what you told me, Greg, that we now have Alex Jones doing the Tim Pool line of a peaceful national divorce, which is totally based on this idea that Kenzior was really debunking about the red and the blue states. So that holds in people's minds. So at the very least, even if you don't believe in an actual hot new American Civil War of states battling states in a military fashion, you can imagine, because you're being told by the pollster types, the PR types, that it's red and blue states, that you could imagine some kind of a civil war, a peaceful national divorce, as Tim Pool and now Alex Jones are calling for. But the truth of the matter is much more that the most divided state in the union at this point politically, if you're just talking about sort of Democrats versus Republicans, is maybe barely a supermajority. Okay, let alone like they're all for Republicans or all for Democrats. Now, obviously, there are certain states where the state power dynamics go one way or the other most intently, and there's a lot there. There's a lot of importance there. But if you think about it at the national level, I think debunking this idea of the red and the blue states is crucial to showing that this whole call now, especially post the non-existent red wave 2022 midterm elections uh, time scheme for a peaceful national divorce, can be debunked and stood down, so we can get back to our actual national political conversation that needs to happen about how we are actually going, all of us together, all of the states, all of the different political ideologies and backgrounds of people, how we're going to figure out what our actual problems are and how we're going to deal with them in a political fashion. All right, so I agree with that. And we were referring to Len Blavatnik the billionaire. And it's interesting. I missed this article, but there was an article from earlier in this year in the New York Intelligencer, the New York Magazine Intelligencer, by Casey Mitchell, who I'm sure will just be called a think tank shill by the Russian sphere alt media.
He works for Bellingcat. Yeah.
So the article is titled "How Russia's Oligarchs Laundered Their Reputations in the West. Sanctions Haven't Touched Their Face-Saving Philanthropy," and it points out that it's not that using donations and philanthropy to to public relations, your oligarch image is not limited to Russian sphere oligarchs. In the second paragraph, they point out they link to the Sackler family and their donations. But they do, in this one, they do focus on the combination of Victor Vexelberg, who now I understand maybe Whitney Webb always just sort of forgets his name, as we forgot Blavatnik's name here, but she never mentions him when she talks about Carbine 911, and it's a key piece of it. It's similarly to the talking about the connection of George Nader with MBZ, and George Nader being considered a crucial backdoor channel to the Kremlin is crucial. So there's this something there in terms of Carbine 911 that is not just about Israeli military intelligence. It's also about these very interesting cutouts and back doors to the Russian sphere and beyond that needs to be factored in here. And we will return to this, but this whole question of where is John Mark Dugan, the former I think Broward County sheriff's deputy who left the country and basically is the U.S. sheriff's deputy version of Ed.
Palm Beach County Sheriff's
Oh,
Office.
Palm Beach. Thank you. Right,
But
because it
still
was
right there in the
in
center of
Epstein's house.
the heart of South Florida, all of this of where like operations were taking place of like what you're describing here, right in the heart of that, in the Miami area.
So Dugan is basically the Ed Snowden of U.S. sheriff deputies. He apparently is a political refugee in Russia now, and I even saw that he's on state media, Russian state. He's a Russian state media paid guy on the ground, justifying, sort of explaining the Ukrainian invasion. He was the go-to guy for a very big Indian news channel to talk about the on the ground of the Russia's Ukraine invasion. But there is a crucial little piece connecting dot here in terms of the Epstein Maxwell inquiry, and that Dugan probably credibly, I would say, is very likely the most credible figure publicly identified who we could say actually has some of the Epstein Maxwell evidence, the video evidence, which is the compromat video evidence. Craig Unger has said that he's even seen what is alleged to be one of these videos, very grainy, and it was just maybe a one or a handful of these videos. But Dugan claims he has these videos. He went to Russia, and then he ends up posting on his own Facebook page that he's met with a key Russian oligarch, a state-sponsored oligarch. Believe his name is Borodin, Borodin, Pavel Borodin, who's also said to be the guy who really brought Putin into the Moscow power scene, which was then became Putin's launching place. And Borodin actually had the desk of the total Kremlin real estate holdings, a very, very powerful post. And this John Mark Dugan is proclaimed in a now taken down Facebook post with a photo of lunching with him. So there's these key tie-ins then to the actual Russian deep state power politics that should also be included here, that are always left out, especially in these kinds of spheres. Like I believe, you know, I believe Whitney Webb. I don't know she's ever said the name Katie Johnson publicly. Now, I did hear her say, referencing the case against Trump, but I don't believe she ever mentioned the name. I still don't believe she's ever said the name Victor Vexelberg publicly. And so these are crucial tie-ins here. And so we'll include the write-up of Vexelberg, Mikhail Friedman, Peter Oven. Peter Oven, this points out, likes to donate millions to the Brandeis University and the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Friedman is an enabler of Putin's inner circle, quoting EU announced sanctions. There's a oligarch who I've never heard of, Vladimir Potanin, who donated to many significant U.S. nonprofits, including the Kennedy Center and the Guggenheim Museum. Potanin managed to obtain seats on the Guggenheim's Board of Trustees and Global Advisory Board of the Council on Foreign Relations think tank, and then it goes into Blavatnik and the Access Industries scenario, the Friedman, Vexelberg, Blavatnik trio. All right. So this is we'll link to all of this. Of course, Deripaska is mentioned. All right. So all right, let's now get into the proof of conspiracy. Now, I know this is probably gonna run us out of a little bit of time to deal with our other electoral politics and media stuff, but we can deal with that in our next episode if that's okay, Greg.
Yep, sounds good.
Because I like the idea of continuing the current analysis while continuing to remind both ourselves and anyone who listens to our shows to the actual nature of the evidence that continues to be covered up by everyone, from Glenn Beck to Whitney Webb, from Jimmy Dore to the alleged progressive Jamal Thomas on Russian state media fault lines, to basically this entire sphere, Tim Pool, Patrick Ben David. And when we pointed out that you don't go then to Rachel Maddow or CNN to get the whole story. No, you got to do just a little bit deeper digging. You go to the Twitter feed of Seth Abramson, where you can get a lot of the actual information if you go back over time. All right. All right, let's go to page 178 of Proof of Conspiracy: How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy, by Seth Abramson. The quote, "The Mueller report concludes its analysis of whether Papadopoulos revealed Mifsud's intelligence to the campaign by noting that the several campaign officials who could not recall such a message from Papadopoulos exhibited, quote, varying degrees of certainty, unquote, in their testimony. Though Senate investigators ultimately do not find the email to which Mashburn refers to in his testimony, the absence of the email in Trump campaign members' digital archives is consistent with a troubling trend noted at several points by the investigators from the special counsel's office who wrote the Mueller report that, quote, some of the individuals we interviewed or whose conduct we investigated, including some associated with the Trump campaign, deleted relevant communications, unquote. See Chapter 11. The evidence compiled in the report will strongly suggest that many of these deletions and much of Trump officials' reliance on encrypted communications were intended to evade future document requests by Congress or other federal investigators. For instance, both Steve Bannon and Eric Prince will claim to have no knowledge of why their phones were missing all text messages from prior to March 2017. A period during which the two men are known to have engaged in illicit meetings with foreign nationals and to have exchanged, per phone records acquired by the special counsel's office, dozens of text messages, unquote. Just a reminder that this is one of the reasons why I really think it's important to break up analyzing these deep state events, whether it's 9/11 or 11/9, or we might say the Epstein-Maxwell operation, into a question of military intelligence and counterintelligence, because the counterintelligence aspect of this is very much related to the cover up, both in the time, such as these encrypted apps, the deletion of information. That's part of the counterintelligence operation. That's like operational security that people like Eric Prince and Steve Bannon are running while in the midst of deploying the 11/9 operation, and helping install Trump. And so it's also then a critical thing if you're, let's say, you're studying military intelligence, cyber aspects, like people like Whitney Webb do, to then deal with the fact that these characters, Bannon and Eric Prince, are in a contemporaneous way at the epicenter of hawking the new generation of so-called secure phone technology. Right? That's why we keep on pointing out how crucial it is that Eric Prince is on Steve Bannon's war room to really give the launch to his quote unquote Patriot phone or whatever it is, while he's on a northern Israeli air base with very obviously using Israeli military intelligence technology to create, and then they're hawking this away. So these guys continue that they're now trying to normalize and to consumerize the kind of technology that they were using in order to run their counterintelligence concealment operations while they were in the midst of doing the 11/9 operation. And one thing I just wanted to point out from before about the article about the usage of philanthropy to wash specifically Russian sphere oligarch reputations is that people like this is some of the really good work that people like Whitney Webb. I would also add Richard Silverstein has done really important work in this realm in terms of this is as a modus operandi of not only oligarchs but like really deep state, and especially oligarchs on the who are on the line, or at least organized criminal adjacent, we might say. And Silverstein has done really good analysis of the way that this works with the role of the Russian sphere Jewish Zionist oligarchs in the Israeli context. For example, the whole story of the Deutsche Bank helping hold the money of Abramovich, who then becomes like the major seed funder to the tune of like 100 million early dollars to the Elad organization, which was crucial to basically the lawfare ethnic cleansing eviction operations in Jerusalem. And so that's then also at the sphere of the Epstein operation, obviously too, in terms of Deutsche Bank, and then you get into Trump and Deutsche Bank and the Russian laundromat, to the dozens of billions of dollars of money laundering, and then you get into Robert Maxwell and Semyon Mogilevich and the entire sort of post-Soviet KGB deep state apparatus set up globally with the dirty money. But what is the dirty money doing? You can follow the money, that's fine, but then you don't stop once you find the money flows. You then see what the money flows at, what actual hardcore political warfare operations are those money flows lubricating. All right, where does the rubber meet the road? It's like focusing on lubrication rather than the actual where is the vehicle that's being lubricated going? Who's driving it? Where is it going? What are the actual mechanisms of all of that? Okay, so I just wanted to point out that this is an area where people like Whitney Webb and Richard Silverstein should be looked to as important researchers. Whitney Webb has done some of the best research about the so-called mega group billionaires, the way that they've laundered their reputations via philanthropy in an American domestic context. She's done, as I pointed out before, done important work about analyzing the Paul Singer role in setting up the whole idea of the startup nation as some kind of philanthropy that's meant to benefit technologists and the entrepreneurial set in general, rather than actually just transfer companies that might start in the United States and make sure that they're actually being started in Israel, with the ultimate political endgame of creating a firewall a corporate firewall. So the United States, as we're beginning to see, as there's growing sentiment critical towards a long-term Israeli policy, state policy against the Palestinians, including in most especially the younger Jewish community in the United States of America, that under those contingent circumstances, the Israeli deep state wanted to make sure that they had a firewall, which is that if the United States is fully populated with Israeli started companies running their critical infrastructure, running potentially their Pentagon's cloud, all of this kind of the chipsets, all of that kind of stuff, or the 911 system in the case of Carbine 911, then it's basically becomes impossible to do an effective boycott, divestment, sanctions, because at that point then it becomes boycotting 911 or boycotting the entirety of the Pentagon's information architecture, or you end up boycotting Silicon Valley in general. You end up boycotting computer chips or computers, which is really the one of the main talking points that the Israeli Hasbara network makes in terms of like the whiny BDS movement. Don't they know that they're using Israeli technology right now to do their whiny stuff about the so-called Palestinian rights? All right, so this is an area that should be focused on, and I think it's crucial. So then to then understand how then you have a Victor Vekselberg inserted into this Epstein, Ehud Barak, Peter Thiel, Michael Chertoff, attempted Israeli military intelligence takeover of the 911 system in the United States, that a very crucial Putin sphere oligarch, Victor Vekselberg, also right there, is crucial then to bring into the mix here. All right. So I just wanted to point out this is both an area where Whitney Webb's journalism has been strong, I think, but then also where these key missing points basically undermine its value in terms of comprehensive understanding here. All right. All right, back to page 178 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. The missing text messages, right? Okay. Quote, the absence of Papadopoulos' email to Mashburn and other Trump campaign officials and campaign members' digital materials is therefore not probative from an investigative standpoint, meaning that it cannot be used to draw a conclusion about whether Papadopoulos lied to federal investigators, again regarding his conduct while working for the Trump campaign. 2 days before Trump's speech at the Mayflower Hotel and a day before Mifsud communicates to Papadopoulos that the Kremlin has thousands of stolen Clinton emails, Trump writes a note to his Russian business associate, Aras Agalarov, who had in late February, according to the Mueller report, quote, expressed interest in Trump's campaign, passed on congratulations for Trump's primary victories, unquote, and issued a quote-unquote offer to Trump of both his own, quote, support and that of many of his important Russian friends and colleagues, especially with reference to U.S.-Russian relations, unquote. Not long after Trump speaks at the Mayflower and MBS rolls out his Vision 2030 plan, this is Thomas Barak successfully orchestrates a meeting between Jared Kushner and Emirati Ambassador Alo Taiba, having written Alo Taiba to confide that Kushner, quote, agrees with our agenda, unquote. Once contact is made between Trump's son-in-law and the Emirati ambassador, Kushner expresses to both Barak and Alo Taiba, and through Alo Taiba to MBZ, that he is, quote, receptive to an alliance among Gulf countries, the United States and Israel, unquote, thereby providing the Red Sea conspirators with a strong indication that Trump and his team embrace their geopolitical agenda. By June 1st, Barak is confidently telling Bloomberg TV that, quote, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel, in my opinion, will align as allies very quickly here, unquote. Barak calls the two Sunni Arab nations and Israel, quote, the best allies to America, unquote, and says that the United States, quote, should reward our energy-producing Middle East partners who are helping us stamp out terrorism abroad, unquote. Asked what he expects Trump's foreign policy to be in the Middle East, Barrack says that instead of a quote-unquote travel ban keeping Muslims from the United States, he thinks Trump would, as president, quote, find a way to make a deal that lessens the impact and starts solving this problem of terrorism, unquote. The New York Times reports that almost immediately after Kushner and Al-Otaiba meet for the first time, the Emirati ambassador, quote, positions himself as an informal advisor on the Middle East to Mr. Kushner, unquote. A breach of diplomatic protocol for the ambassador, whose role in the midst of a U.S. election by tradition would be to avoid even attending partisan political events, let alone assuming the role of a quote-unquote advisor to one of the nation's two competing presidential campaigns. Indeed, Al-Otaiba's actions during the general elections likely involve repeated solicitations for Kushner to violate the Logan Act 18 U.S.C. 953, a federal criminal statute that regulates U.S. citizens' ability to discuss policy issues with foreign diplomats, quote, with intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government or of any officer or agent thereof in relation to any disputes or controversies with the United States, unquote. Al-Otaiba becomes much more than simply a protocol-breaching policy advisor to Jared Kushner, however. In the same way Trump aides such as George Papadopoulos work behind the scenes to set up a meeting between Trump and Putin during the campaign, the sort of summit that must be handled delicately because of its potential inappropriateness per diplomatic norms. By June 2016, Al-Otaiba is trying to, quote, arrange meetings between Saudi Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the Trump campaign, unquote, with Barrack's assistance, which likewise could become inappropriate if they involved any substantive discussion of changes to U.S. foreign policy under a prospective Trump administration, unquote. Little is known of Al-Otaiba's clandestine machinations in early summer 2016, except that they appear to culminate in an August 3, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower between MBZ's emissary George Nader, MBZ advisor Eric Prince, MBZ consultant Joel Zamel, Trump policy advisor Stephen Miller, and Trump's son, Don Jr. See Chapter 5. A second result is undoubtedly a meeting at Trump Tower in December 2016 between MBZ and Kushner, at which meeting MBZ, quote, recommends Prince Mohammed of Saudi Arabia as a promising young leader, unquote, according to a person familiar with the meeting who speaks to the New York Times. Though present reporting does not indicate that Trump attended Kushner's meeting with MBZ, this is consistent with a trend observable within both the Trump campaign and Trump transition, not acknowledging any meetings Trump may have attended, even when, as with the December 2016 Kushner-MBZ meeting, Trump was available to meet, was possibly even in the building where the meeting occurred as it happened, and MBZ's ambassador Al-Otaiba had been working for 6 months to connect MBZ to Trump's inner circle. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine a de facto head of state with such long-standing, if mediated, ties to the Trump campaign breaching international diplomatic protocol to enter the United States secretly, traveling to Trump Tower, and then being denied access to the president-elect. Just 4 days before Barrack's June 1st interview with Bloomberg TV about Trump's prospective foreign policy with respect to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, the Trump campaign sends the preeminent Israel expert on its National Security Advisory Committee, George Papadopoulos, to Greece. Papadopoulos' visit coincides with a visit to the city by Vladimir Putin, and both Papadopoulos and Putin meet with the same government official while in Athens, Greek Defense Minister Panos Kamenos, in both instances discussing the subject of U.S. sanctions on Russia. Between Papadopoulos' two visits to Greece in May 2016, one in early May and one in late May, one of Papadopoulos' chief supervisors, Sam Clovis, the man who hired Papadopoulos to the campaign in March, receives a message from a relative of Trump Organization attorney Jason Greenblatt. Greenblatt is Trump's future special envoy to the Middle East. His relative is writing Clovis to try to arrange a Trump-Putin summit through Burel Lazar, a Russian rabbi who is, quote, a very close confidant of Putin, unquote. Greenblatt's relative, and Lazar ultimately convene at Trump Tower in the summer of 2016 for a meeting, though whom they meet with at Trump Tower is unknown, and their reason for selecting Clovis as their campaign contact for a secret Trump-Putin summit is unclear. Lazar will later claim that despite being put forward as a critical conduit for future Trump-Putin communications, and despite having met with one of the Republican presidential candidate's top attorneys, he subsequently kept from Putin any information about his meeting at Trump Tower. It is shortly after this initial outreach by Lazar that the Trump campaign's chief Israeli expert, Papadopoulos, travels to Athens with Clovis's permission while Putin is already in the city, the Russian president's only trip to an EU country during the 2016 presidential campaign, and to precisely the sort of quote-unquote neutral city Papadopoulos had previously told his campaign superiors the Kremlin preferred to use for covert meetings. Unquote. That's the end of that section. Now, I want to get into the next section because it gets now into the question of Fabrizio and Manafort and the whole role that these quote-unquote pollsters play, right? Remember, Manafort is also a Finkelstein protege, alongside people like Roger Stone and Fabrizio. So, is that okay, Greg, or should we hold on till next time?
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. And I just wanted to, before moving on, just some of those names that were in that previous chapter there. Once again, more important names of this relative of Jason Greenblatt, who goes on to be the special envoy to the Middle East under Trump, and Burrell Lazar, the Chabad chief rabbi of Russia, and very known for his relationship with Putin. Things that don't get discussed in the grand nature of all things related to 11/9 and some of the bigger global geopolitical elements as far as the Trump 2016 operation and all the consequences surrounding it goes, is that these names are not mentioned in there. And this will figure into our conversation later, but like the fact that you don't even get like Rel Lazar mentioned as far as like a figure in this whole Trump drama. Here we're linking the Middle East envoy as far as the person who's going to be overseeing these paving the way for things such as the Abraham Accords and the making of quote unquote peace with the with the Saudis, the Emiratis, etc., and bringing it right to Putin's friend, his Chabad rabbi of Russia, who has publicly defended Russia's involvement in Syria, among other things, and Assad, and that this is important, and it's very, very. I can't think of any cases where this has been significantly focused on. The mentioning of Jewish names and the Jewish oligarch names and connections to Putin was described as an anti. Basically, it was described as claiming that Putin uses Jews to run the world or whatever by Joel, or it was by I believe by Aaron Klein or Joel Pollack, one of the two, on the pages of Breitbart.com. There was the Politico article, Trump's the happy-go-lucky Jewish group that connects Trump and Putin. I think there was a blanket dismissal of that as basically anti-Semitic, and then it really wasn't picked up anywhere else. These are the dynamics here that are important to understand from a 11/9 context, from a global elements of 2016 that are important there with relation to Greenblatt and this direct relative and Burrell Lazar, that has been just about the exception of right there. That's one of the few places I think this has been picked up on, and it doesn't get any attention. And I think it is important context for what went on in 2016 and beyond, and the geopolitical elements at play with this, as well as elements of religious elements and geopolitical elements that is not focused on at all, much less to the extent it needs to be or it should be.
Definitely, and this is also why I think why it's important to continue coming back to the actual facts of the 11/9 operation. And one thing, especially now that we were reading this in the wake of Thomas Barrack being found not guilty on all 9 accounts, people would say, well, that just suggests that there's a nothing burger here, that all these facts mean nothing legally. Now, I I I made a point when I interviewed Seth Abramson for the Understanding Israel Palestine show on KKFI that one of the problems here was that because the 11/9 operation, or the Trump, the Red Sea conspiracy, was an intelligence operation, that designed into it would be things like firewalls, intelligence style firewalls, and basically architected plausible deniability, and that one of the problems with dealing with intelligence operations, and thus counterintelligence operations, in just the legal capacity, is that especially in terms of the domestic security services, let's say in terms of U.S. intelligence, there's always going to be both someone who's protecting on the factual side, sources and methods and all of that, but then designed into the operation is going to be ways for making it seem plausibly deniable. And so this all goes back then to the continuity of like the actual world scale level deep politics of clandestine operations, especially in a Cold War architecture, and then what actually became of that, how that transmogrified after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the unipolar moment and the proclamation of the end of history by Fukuyama, and the paleo neocons seizing on that moment to drive a call for an assertion of U.S. global hegemony in many ways, and then the disastrous policies that then sort of come from that in the direct wake of that, where there seems to be other operators who might have actually been potentially doing what the United States did with the Soviet Union in terms of Afghanistan, the luring into empire ending, drawn out, endless conflict, and those kinds of things. So I just think that there's to begin to understand the way that an intelligence operation actually is deployed in a way that includes information. This is what Abramson pointed out in response to me about the difficulty of basically trying to try a full on intelligent, globally scoped intelligence operation in just the U.S. Domestic court system. Uh, Abramson responded, I think, fairly, that at the very least, sometimes we get counterintelligence information or intelligence information from legal proceedings. So I think that's the way to think about it. If we're actually trying to do a full spectrum analysis, you use legal proceedings to get information, and then include that alongside journalistic information, including archival information, including direct multimedia analysis, in the way that we like to then incorporate in terms of analyzing the narratives in different spheres and all that, to begin to really understand what's going on here. And so I think that structure of Cold War espionage, spook politics, really, it never ended. At some level, they got a little bit more complex and baroque after the fall of the Soviet Union and the recognized end of the Cold War. But as we pointed out, they just then get folded into these larger ongoing structures of what we've called the twin pillars of the contemporary weaponized politics of the culture war and the terror war. And you then begin to see some of these, not only the same kind of MOs working as they did in the Cold War, but even some of the same exact networks in this case, which is why I still think that the Maxwell Mogilevich connection is crucial to understanding this contemporary moment. And by the way, who did Maxwell go to right before he was apparently assassinated in terms of some of his money issues? Kroll Incorporated. And who is FTX, I believe, is their agent for handling this, any claims coming forward from this. And by the way, what I forgot to mention was that what's being pointed out, which is important, that not only was FTX and Bankman-Fried a key political financier, especially for the Democrats, and Bankman-Fried was basically looked like he was making the move to become the biggest investor, political contributor, especially in terms of the Democrats moving into 2024. Now, this is all going to be covered up, and there was money flow in terms of Ukraine. Some of the donations to Ukraine were run through FTX and all of that. But continue to believe that this question of Mogilevich and Maxwell, and especially if you're going to do the Whitney Webb, Catherine Austin Fitz line of like just follow the black money, then yeah, all right, you follow that black money into actual political machinations, which in the Epstein Maxwell world really do lead to the formation of the global Mogilevich network, which was actually the Kremlin's, Silovisi, the high-level deep state operatives preparing their place in a post-Soviet world. And it was global in architecture, financially lubricated, but continued the covert operations and the spy versus spy kind of operations that were replete throughout the Cold War. So that's partially why I think to really continue to unpack the 11/9 operation is crucial. Even though I understand there's a lot of facts here. There's a lot of names to deal with. It seems like old news in a certain way, but the fact that people even deny that this happened, this would be like we were in, you know, the second term of George W. Bush, and people were denying that 9/11 even happened, or that 9/11 was an intelligence operation of some sort. So that's why I continue to believe that this is crucial information to unfold as we continue to do our contemporary media and political analysis.
Real quick, I wanted to the article that I was referring to from Breitbart was by Aaron Klein from January 31st, 2018. Fusion GPS founder unhinged. Putin uses Jews to control the world. Glenn R. Simpson, the co-founder of the controversial opposition research firm Fusion GPS, espoused a conspiracy theory claiming that Vladimir Putin, quote, essentially took over the Russian Jewish community, end quote, and that Putin uses, quote, the Jewish diaspora as a route for Russian influence. And I just wanted to clarify that. Aaron Klein actually went from WorldNet Daily to Breitbart to chief strategist for Benjamin Netanyahu back in 2021. So that's quite a career trajectory there, a primary purveyor of the constant threat of terrorism and how Obama is a Sharia worshipping terrorist, would-be terrorist and all that. So that's what I was referring to was Aaron Klein, that Fusion GPS unhinged conspiracy theory that Putin uses Jews to control the world. So
Yes. All right. Good. And that political article, the Happy Go Lucky group, that's a very interesting article, and very journalistically credible, and so it's important to see exactly who attacked it, using the totally weaponized terms of anti-Semitism. And we're going to start dealing with also with the way when we begin to deal with the more media cultural side of this in terms of Jon Stewart and Dave Chappelle and the ongoing wake of Ye West and Kyrie Irving and the backlash and all of that, that there is to me, it does seem that we're looking at an architecture of really trying to insert us into a new anti-Semitism as proposed by Natan Sharansky, and obviously highlighted by our current, uh, you know, anti-Semitism czar or diplomat, um, Professor. What's her name again?
we're talking about
Wexner's long-term Deborah Lipstadt.
Deborah Lipstadt, yes, Deborah Lipstadt, yes.
And I heard Jon Stewart sort of being the voice who, knowingly or not, was articulating the kind of sort of Israel critical lines that actually are used to define what you are allowed to say in relationship to quote unquote Palestinian solidarity, which is in fact not you're not allowed to actually advocate for what the actual probably 100 years of Palestinian intellectual and political and actual legitimate moral leadership, not these fake leaders that have been set up for them, but the actual Palestinian political street and intellectual leadership. You can't be on their side ultimately and not be called a new anti-Semite, because they don't they don't believe that it is just, or it's going to actually be a solution to the so-called Palestinian problem to actually have a quote unquote Jewish state. And I think they're right. And I'm not a self hating Jew. I'm not a new self hating Jew or a new anti Semite. You can have the potential for a Jewish homeland without a Jewish state. And ultimately, the internal contradiction and ultimate moral conflict, I would say, between Caroline Glick's Freudian slip of how to protect the Jewish demographic state. Oh, I mean the Jewish democratic state. The question of demography versus democracy is a long-term inherent contradiction on top of the moral outrage of creating an ethno-religious state midway through the 20th century on the backs of indigenous people. All right. So these are the architectures of the new talking points that we're going to be stuck into is the new anti-Semitism, and you'll see even on Twitter that the B'nai B'rith is pushing hard to get Elon Musk to adopt the IHRA, I think it is, International Holocaust something Association's definition of anti-Semitism as the go-to for the question of hate speech on Twitter. And Elon Musk specifically has said that the way that he wants to deal with questions of what he says negative speech or hate speech is not to eject people, to kick them off the platform, but to basically full downrank them is the way that you would call it in terms of search or Google search. But it also could be called shadow banning, but it won't be shadow because it'll be very overt, and where there will be just a separate feed of tweets that are then considered to be either negative or hateful. And if the B'nai B'rith gets their way with Elon Musk, then it's going to be defined in relationship to the new the quote unquote principles of the new anti-Semitism, which one of the principles is about questioning the actual legitimacy of a Jewish state, which many, I would point out, there are multitudes of Jews of all kinds of different religious or non-religious persuasions who question the legitimacy of the Jewish state, along with, of course, many, many, many millions of other people in the United States and around the world, most especially the actual Palestinian moral heart. So I just wanted to point that out. And then one other thing, Greg, I noticed in the previous section, but there's these key European figures, especially this is what actually made me think of how we got to really re-up our understanding of Cold War politics, especially in terms of the information sphere, of the political sphere, in terms of like these key figures. It pointed out that Papadopoulos and Putin went to Greece at the same time, right? And the key figure there was this Greek defense minister, Panos Kamenos. We've talked about him a little bit before. Now, what that reminded me of is that there's a new go-to figure. She seems to be getting as much or more play even on the Russian state media, Sputnik Radio, Fault Line, morning show, airwaves as even Scott Ritter seems to. And this is a former Austrian minister of foreign affairs, Karin Kneissel. And actually, they bring her in to talk about Israel Palestine and Israeli politics a lot, but also they focus on the what they're calling the new McCarthyism, or the unfairness of certain public figures who have been targeted by sanctions. And some of the issue, of course, here is they never mention that her actual background. It's not because she was just some kind of, outspoken proponent of against NATO, or, of the potential Russian interests or reasons for the Ukrainian invasion. But they totally just didn't, they never mentioned to their audience that she was actually on the board. She was on the supervisory board of Rosneft, the major Russian oil company, between June 2021 and May 2022. She was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. And so it's not just because she has an opinion; it's because she was, materially being supported by the Russian state in that way. And so there's these figures who seem to have this long term, at the very least, cultivation that doesn't seem organic. It's not just because she's of good conscience. She then starts taking all this money from Rosneft, and then and then pops up. Okay, of course she's a foreign minister, so she's gonna have other state officials. If she gets married, she has a wedding. But there she is, dancing with Putin, and then ultimately bowing to Putin, who gives her this $50,000 gift for her wedding during these key years. While I believe it was while she was the minister of foreign affairs in Austria. And so I just wanted to bring into some of these key figures in a European theater, who seem to, yeah, they're assets of some sort, and then they're then promoted as just sort of dissidents. They're assets for another sphere's interests, and then they're promoted as just domestic dissidents being unfairly treated. And so this is an MO, I think, that we see in a lot of the alt media, especially the Russian sphere alt media. All right, Greg, should we get into a little bit of this new section, or are we a little bit too long here and start this up next time? What do you think?
I think if we've I mean, I've got I'm fine with doing it now. If you want to, I'm fine with going either way. But
Okay, let's do at least some of the part that deals with Fabrizio and Manafort, and then we'll start getting into the areas where it begins to intersect with the Israeli intelligence, and then another Arthur Finkelstein protege, George Birnbaum, a key Netanyahu operative, and then the glaring question of Netanyahu's role in the 11/9 operation in quote unquote Trump Russia, especially as Netanyahu comes on the scene. And so maybe we can explore some of that data in a future show where we're dealing with the media surrounding that.
okay. And real quick, the organization that drafted this for Elon Musk is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA.
And there's a big, controversy for a few years now over that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, including in Jewish intellectual spheres and Jewish activist spheres, some of which push back against it too, because it's overbearing in relationship to what's acceptable around quote unquote criticism of Israel. All right. We are on page 181 of Proof of Conspiracy: How Trump's International Collusion is Threatening American Democracy, by Seth Abramson. Quote, on May 26, 2016, Trump officially clinches the GOP nomination. 2 weeks later, he returns to his old line of attack regarding Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis are willing to collude illegally with an American politician if they believe that politician is willing to act in their interests as president. In June 2016, he accuses Saudi Arabia of giving, quote, vast amounts of money to the Clinton Foundation, unquote. Money, Trump says, that Clinton must return because Saudi Arabia, quote, wants women as slaves and to kill gays, unquote. Trump follows this tweet with a demand that, quote unquote, crooked Hillary, quote, call on Saudi Arabia and other countries to stop funding hate. I am calling on her to immediately return the $25 million she got from them for the Clinton Foundation, unquote. These are the last two tweets mentioning Saudi Arabia that Trump will publish before Election Day, and indeed the last substantive tweet referencing the kingdom he will issue before visiting Riyadh in May 2017 as president. Unquote. I just want to point out that there's a very interesting parallel here that is related to what some of the critical problems of Whitney Webb's appearance on both the PBD podcast, but then ultimately the Glenn Beck podcast, most especially, where I believe it was on the Glenn Beck podcast that she and Glenn were developing the line that because and maybe this was on the PBD podcast, I can't remember, but that because Trump brought up Clinton and Epstein and brought in the alleged victims of Bill Clinton, sexual assault victims of Bill Clinton, to sit into one of their debates, that would suggest that why would Trump bring up Epstein if he were actually as compromised by Epstein as Clinton was. And there was no pushback on this, even though, as we pointed out for years and years and years, this is the Roy Cohn MO. Roy Cohn, the key Trump lawyer, key Trump guru in terms of the dark arts of political warfare, that you would especially, anytime you see Trump attacking the other side for some kind of specific reason, you can almost guarantee that this is an area where he's maybe even more compromised. Not that this is a place where he feels innocent. No, this is a long-term, decades-long MO. You make counter assertions. You attack and you make counter assertions, counterattacks. You deny everything and make counterattacks, right? That's the MO. I would say the fact that Trump brought up the Epstein Island thing in Clinton says, oh, maybe we should go look at the Wexner mansion in Manhattan that Epstein owned with all the cameras in it that Epstein had when he and Trump were running around with Thomas Barrack as the Three Musketeers, and when Trump and Epstein were credibly accused of raping a teenage girl, and then Trump specifically threatening her life and throwing money at her for a potential abortion. All right? That was not even mentioned by Whitney Webb. She went along with this kind of ridiculous, quote unquote, analysis of how could Trump be as compromised or as guilty in relationship to Epstein as Clinton because he initiated the attack. No, I would say that's actually just more evidence that this is an area where he's potentially, even at the very least, even more directly criminally and morally compromised by Epstein than even maybe Bill Clinton is.
Yep, and that whole strategy of having the Clinton rape accusers and victims at the debate, that was the aforementioned Aaron Klein, who wrote the Putin Fusion GPS Unhinged Putin Jewish Global Conspiracy article and went on to be direct advisor to Netanyahu. So that was his brainchild.
There you go. And now we know exactly on this Trump Saudi tip that Trump just immediately, if he was not already deeply in bed, as as part of this book is pointing out, that at the very least, his campaign and his networks were developing the operation, the Red Sea conspiracy operation, with MBS and MBZ and apparently Netanyahu's people back on into Putin. All right. And all then the U.S. domestic operatives. And so then Trump then goes from attacking Hillary Clinton, return the money for the Clinton Foundation. Of course, that's also the Epstein money, compromise, the most intense, obvious compromise of the Clintons in terms of Epstein Maxwell, right, is the Clinton Foundation funding. Did Epstein help start the Clinton Foundation with major seed money? Yes, right. And so then also then what was Donald Trump and Epstein's involvement in when during the actually right before Clinton came into power? Were they there raping teenage girls, very likely on film? Yeah, that's also very very compromised too. Okay. And so we saw Trump ultimately be even more compromised by his Saudi entanglements and Saudi emoluments as he became president of the United States. Obviously, you remember what his big orb deal there, right? And remember who was also in the picture with the big orb deal with the Saudis? It was also, I believe, president of Egypt, Al Sisi, who is in that picture. He's also part of the Red Sea conspiracy. But then when it came down to Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post hired journalist being hacked up by an operation going to the very heights of the Saudi government and MBS, very likely, quote unquote, pushing the button on it, he said, yeah, there's so much money. They give us so much money. And at that point he was talking about, weapons and stuff like that. But as we know now, there was also actually personal familial emoluments, all right, in terms of the Trump family, the Kushners, all of that. All right. So we know that this is proof positive that Trump will attack his opponent in a place where at the very least he becomes even more compromised, I would say, than them in terms of the area of attack, the money, and the hypocrisy, the moral hypocrisy in the way that he was attacking Hillary Clinton. All right, back to page 181 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, these are the last two tweets mentioning Saudi Arabia that Trump will publish before Election Day, and indeed the last substantive tweet referencing the kingdom he will issue before visiting Riyadh in May 2017 as president. Post-June events involving Trump and Saudi intermediaries do much to explain the notoriously vociferous tweeters' 5-month pre-election silence on Twitter regarding the oil-rich Arab nation, a period of quiescence that is out of keeping with Trump's long-established pattern on the social media platform. In May 2016, the same month Trump clinches the Republican nomination, and his new, quote, de facto campaign manager, unquote, Paul Manafort, orders Deputy Campaign Manager Rick Gates to share internal Trump campaign polling data with Russian intelligence, Manafort convinces Trump to hire Tony Fabrizio as the campaign's chief pollster. Manafort had begun, quote, advocating Fabrizio's hiring soon after he joined Trump's campaign in March, unquote, despite having himself only been hired by Trump as a, quote, delegate counter, unquote. Unquote. An aside here, this what we'll do is we'll get through some of this information on Fabrizio and Manafort and the polling information in the Russian sphere, and then that will then lead, as if we were doing an analysis of who these guys and their background actually is, which is they are Arthur Finkelstein, they are Finky's kids, they are part of that network. You would know almost inherently that this is going to then go back into the Israeli sphere. As we pointed out over and over again, pointed it out actually with when I interviewed Whitney Webb for the Understanding Israel Palestine KKFI show, that Finkelstein not only was this key figure in bringing Trump in to the core of the Republican Party in 2016, but he was also the guy who was core to bringing Netanyahu in 1996. All right, so you know that this is going to come back around and involve the Israeli sphere. So we'll just get through some of this Russian sphere stuff, and then we'll get into the more Israeli sphere centric stuff in the future. And by the way, this whole question of delegate counter, right? This is also what some of the Israeli intelligence corporate cutouts were being proposed to work on in the early part of 2016 was delegate wrangling operations. Now, that had already, by the time that it seemed to have shaken out, it seemed to have already taken place successfully, and Trump was the nominee. And then, so then those appeared to shift into questions of suppressing the Democratic Party voters potentially. All right. Quote, the long relationship between Manafort and Fabrizio is sufficiently close or sufficiently fraught that it will be revealed in March 2019 that Fabrizio is secretly funneling substantial sums, at least $125,000, into Manafort's legal defense against a bevy of federal criminal charges. CNBC notes that, quote, the path taken by this $125,000 also highlights the ways that Manafort took advantage of the Trump campaign's underdeveloped leadership structure to install his allies in top positions across the Trump political landscape, unquote. Fabrizio is a longtime friend and neighbor of Roger Stone's, as well as a former business associate of both Manafort and new Trump deputy campaign manager Rick Gates. Fabrizio has known Stone for 38 years and has known Manafort for at least 27 years, working with Manafort and his deputy Gates in assisting pro-Kremlin Ukrainian politicians between 2011 and 2012. According to the Mueller report, quote, Gates said to the special counsel's office that Manafort's instruction to send polling data to Kilimnik included sending internal polling data prepared for the Trump campaign by pollster Tony Fabrizio. Fabrizio had worked with Manafort for years and was brought into the campaign by Manafort, unquote. The report will capture July and August 2016 emails from Kilimnik to associates and journalists in the United States, in which the Russian spy boasts of having seen, quote, internal campaign polling, unquote, and having special insight into the, quote, status of the Trump campaign and Trump's prospects for victory, unquote. All critical pieces of data for the Kremlin in assessing and evolving its election interference strategy in the summer of 2016. Kilimnik is boasting of having unique access to the Trump campaign just a matter of days after an early July email from Manafort promising Kilimnik and or Deripaska, quote-unquote, private briefings on the campaign if they want them. Manafort will concede to the special counsel's office that at the time he made the offer to Kilimnik and Deripaska, he expected the latter to, quote-unquote, use him post-election, quote, to advance whatever interests Deripaska had in the United States, unquote. Interests that Deripaska has himself identified as coextensive with those of the Kremlin. Manafort concedes, too, that he did, quote, brief Kilimnik on the Trump campaign, unquote, and that he knew the content of his briefings would get back to, quote, individuals in Ukraine and elsewhere. The quote-unquote elsewhere, almost certainly a reference to Moscow, given Deripaska's publicly stated allegiance to the Kremlin's agenda. The data Manafort communicates to Russian intelligence includes not just proprietary internal campaign polling data, but, quote, discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identifies to Kilimnik as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota, unquote. Only one of these states, Michigan, had previously in 2014 been identified by the Internet Research Agency as a key state for its pre-election domestic reconnaissance, with the IRA's scouting activity in the United States in that year being focused on presumed battleground states Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado, as well as larger non-battleground states like California, Illinois, Texas, and New York. And just in a quick aside, I remember the Internet Research Agency was stood up by the hot dog vendor Prigozhin, not just the beyond Eric Prince of Russia, as we keep on pointing out, but Max Blumenthal calls him a hot dog vendor. Prigozhin, the Eric Prince of and beyond of Russia, not only Putin's chef, but also a key operative in terms of Russian private military contractors, especially the Wagner group. But also remember, Prigozhin helps stand up the information warfare part of this out of the Internet Research Agency too. All right. Back to the text, page 183 of Proof of Conspiracy by Seth Abramson. Quote, by the fall of 2016, the chief foci of IRA activity will be two of the four states Manafort commended to the Kremlin, Michigan and Wisconsin, with CNN reporting in October 2017 that the Kremlin's illicit maneuvers in these two states, quote, appeared to be highly sophisticated in their targeting of key demographic groups in areas of the state that turned out to be pivotal, unquote. The IRA will also be found to have launched, quote, a series of pro-Trump rallies across both Florida and Pennsylvania in the months leading up to the election, unquote, thereby reaching one of the other two states that Manafort had previously indicated to Russian intelligence would be a key election battleground. Manafort will subsequently lie to the special counsel's office about whether he discussed, quote, battleground states, unquote, with Kremlin agents in August 2016 or at any other time. Because Tony Fabrizio, upon his hire by the Trump campaign in May 2016, becomes Trump's chief pollster, quote, it is his job to share polling information with Trump's campaign manager, unquote, Manafort. The polling firm Fabrizio most closely liaises with during his work on Trump's campaign, National Research, is responsible during the 2016 campaign for putting polls in the field in, among several other battlegrounds, Michigan and Wisconsin, two of the three states, quote, where both the Trump campaign and Russia's Internet Research Agency focus their efforts, unquote. The New Yorker will note that one reason Russia would have wanted Fabrizio's polling data from Manafort is that the data, quote, potentially offered demographic targets for Russia's pre-election bots and propaganda, unquote. The Fabrizio polling data, Manafort and Gates, both of whom will later be indicted by Robert Mueller, transmit to the Kremlin is 75 pages of quote-unquote relevant, very detailed, very complex information that is the quote-unquote most recent available internally within the Trump campaign. Indeed, it is so advanced that Manafort's lawyer will, after Manafort is indicted, tell a federal court that he cannot himself understand it. For Kalimnik's part, he will send at least 6 emails, believed to be to Manafort and Gates, though the emails are redacted in court filings regarding the data. Additional court filings suggest that the data Manafort and Gates give Kalimnik may have come from the very end of the Republican primary season, a fact that leaves open the possibility that some of the polling data Manafort has Gates transmit in the final months of the 2016 campaign is from Cambridge Analytica. According to the BBC, in working with the Trump campaign during the general election, Cambridge Analytica largely used, quote, legacy data models, unquote, and primary campaign hard data, that is, information it had gathered while working on behalf of Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Adam Geller, the founder and CEO of National Research, which collected Fabrizio's data for not just Michigan and Wisconsin, but also battleground states Missouri and Iowa, now says that, quote, I honestly have no idea what was shared with the Russians, unquote. Broadly, however, it is known that Fabrizio's internal polling data by Fabrizio's admission after the election micro-targeted and micro-analyzed American voters not just by state but by race, income level, voting habits, and their opinion of America's socio-cultural trajectory, aka culture war, right? Fabrizio also assessed voters' susceptibility to the sort of racialized appeals on immigration and other hot-button issues that both the Trump campaign and the Internet Research Agency would later exploit in seeking election-clinching victories for Trump in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Fabrizio is not a solo operator upon his hire by his longtime associates Manafort and Gates in May 2016. In fact, he works for Arthur J. Finkelstein and Associates, a consultancy run by controversial right-wing political consultants Arthur Finkelstein and George Birnbaum. Apart from having advised both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, Finkelstein is famous for having been the, quote, secret campaign manager, unquote, behind Benjamin Netanyahu's historically narrow election as Prime Minister of Israel in 1996, a campaign that made Finkelstein a quote-unquote star, according to BuzzFeed News. 2 years later, Finkelstein hired Birnbaum to work with him for Netanyahu's Likud party, and 10 years after that, in 2008, Finkelstein and Birnbaum were loaned by their client Netanyahu to an aspiring Hungarian politician, Viktor Orban, a man who, after becoming Hungary's prime minister in 2010, will in July 2016 reach diplomatic convention by endorsing Donald Trump for president. As of 2018, one of Orban's top political advisors is another Trump ally, Steve Bannon, CEO of Trump's presidential campaign. By 2016, Finkelstein and Birnbaum are famous for their years of work for Orban, whose 2010 election as Hungarian prime minister, his second stint in the role, was considered an, quote, electoral masterpiece with implications around the world, unquote. One implication of Finkelstein and Birnbaum's actions is Orban's construction of an anti-Semitic alternate reality inside Hungary's cloistered political sphere, one in which George Soros, a wealthy Hungarian-born Jew with few ongoing ties to Hungary, is positioned as the nation's foremost boogeyman. Finkelstein and Birnbaum's demonization of Soros not only bolsters Orban's political standing in Hungary, but, quote, pleases his Russian neighbors, unquote, as, quote, Putin was afraid of the so-called, quote-unquote, color revolutions, popular uprisings like the one in Ukraine and the Arab Spring, and had begun attacking Soros and his support for liberal causes, unquote, as a domestic distraction. By 2016, Finkelstein and Birnbaum have made Orban's 2018 re-election campaign almost entirely about certain Hungarians' implicitly anti-Semitic fear of the octogenarian Soros. As The Intercept will note, Orban was thus convinced by two Jewish men, Finkelstein and Birnbaum, to, quote, focus his entire re-election campaign on the imaginary threat to Hungary posed by Soros, unquote. Per BuzzFeed News, quote, Orban's campaign against Soros never actually used the word Jew, but it was often implicit. Orban told his people they would have to fight against an quote-unquote enemy who is quote-unquote different, who didn't have a quote-unquote home. It was common to see anti-Semitic graffiti on quote-unquote Stop Soros ads. Voters knew what they were being told, unquote. Incredibly, quote, even Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's son, Yair, posted an anti-Semitic meme in 2017 showing Soros and reptilians controlling the world, unquote.
This was what made the Daily Stormer, Andrew Anglin's website, the world's #1 Yair Netanyahu fan site. That actually was a thing. And think about this. When you consider this, like, it's very similar to the alt-right anti-Jewish sentiments. Just the difference is basically that one is portraying George Soros himself as being anti-Jewish, while the other one is putting Soros at the center of the Jewish global conspiracy. And even the Soros is anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic that's coming from this whole Finkelstein-Birnbaum network of operatives is playing on the very same Jewish global Jews control the world tropes and sentiments that are put out there by the alt-right, like in terms of Soros being the puppet master that's handling the refugees, and Soros being the puppet master of the destruction of countries. And that in this case, like the big difference is that it's that it's that Soros is the person trying to destroy Israel and the Jewish people rather than being at the heart of the global Jewish conspiracy. But the sentiments and the tropes that are used are pretty much exactly the same.
And this is why I believe this is directly related when we begin to re-engage in the conversation of the culture war moment in terms of Ye and Irving and Jon Stewart and Dave Chappelle and Ben Shapiro and Lex Friedman. This is why we always, focus on power and politics rather than quote unquote cosmopolitan or alien Jews and that kind of rhetoric. And as we keep on pointing out, it's almost always, as you point out, that's so obvious that some, a key figure of like the anti-Jewish alt-right, memosphere directly parallel to Kevin Barrett at the UNS review of an Andrew Anglin. Um, loves the actual sort of, the actual quote unquote anti-Jewish dog whistling of the cosmopolitan, of someone who's an outsider who's different. They love that kind of actual, sort of historically anti-Jewish troping in ways that they actually end up serving the actual power in politics, the geopolitics, the power politics. And this is so explicit in this story, obviously, where you're actually dealing with power politics, a Jewish power politics in many cases in terms of this. When you're dealing with Netanyahu, you're dealing with Finkelstein, you're dealing with Birnbaum, you're dealing with the intersection of the Jewish state and its power being deployed, both geopolitically and information wise, and all of that. And then meanwhile, it's still not talked about that this key figure, this key long-term Israeli military intelligence figure who was tapped to acquire for the Israeli state decades back key missing material, whether nuclear, biological, or chemical. One, Arnon Milchan, also a key Hollywood player, right? The executive producer of Oliver Stone's JFK, many other films, right? And a key player in Hollywood, that he's still not mentioned as as an apparent, ally of this Orban operation, being that his closest friend, Andy Vanya, another Hungarian born Jew like George Soros, it was actually then put into place with Orban after Orban's win in consolidating Orban's media apparatus, authoritarian move to consolidate media power in the Hungarian sphere is the Andy Vanya basically partnership with Arnon Milchan kind of operation. And that needs to be discussed too, because of course Milchan is also a key player in what's going on with the prime minister investigations, Netanyahu's massive corruption indictments and investigations in the domestic sphere in Israel. Milchan is directly and materially involved in in some of those cases, and is a key figure going way back. And once again, you got to then look at the question of Maxwell, of Robert Maxwell, probably a key actual. Everyone says Mossad, but he was actually very likely a key Lakam, which is the Bureau of Scientific Relations, I think. Started by people like Shimon Peres, where they actually were really interested in both weapons material, as I pointed out. It's often talked about, like by the Ryan Dawson types, that Milchan's role was in acquiring material for nuclear triggers, critrons, in an American context. But it's also the case, as I pointed out, from the biography written about him, that he was actually there to acquire not only nuclear materials but also biological and chemical. And now remember, Robert Maxwell is a key figure of informational material, right? Handbooks, own Macmillan, right? Textbooks, but he was also able to utilize his contacts in the Soviet sphere and then back into the West. Remember, he's also the key guy getting the Promise software into the heart of the U.S. nuclear establishment. In that case, it's obvious that's an information warfare kind of operation that's then backing up the actual then absconding with, decommissioned nuclear material in the decades subsequent. So Robert Maxwell is another key Lacam character where he's acquiring material, in this case, information material around the world and giving it back to the heart of the Israeli military establishment. And so Maxwell's then connection to the highest levels of both the actual government apparatus in Soviet Russia in terms of Khrushchev, a KGB director, but also then the underside of the Russian deep state, such organized crime of Mogilevich, Maxwell being this key character in engaging and giving Mogilevich the informational and know-how materials to be able to set up a multi-billion-dollar global money laundering and trafficking operation that continues on into this day and is obviously crucial to some of the actual, deep state operations of the ongoing Russian intelligence apparatus. So that is really crucial. So this question of the Finkelstein people, you gotta unpack that. You gotta unpack that. And Hungary is a crucial place to understand, as we pointed out in terms of that. All right, Greg. I think we've now come to the end of the next little section in here begins to really get into the Joel Zamel and the Psy Group and the very Israeli intelligence piece of this. So this might be a good place for us to call it an end for this episode.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Jeremy, and just thanks to everybody for sticking with us. We will get to our political roundup here, but we've yeah, we'll get back into this, and because what you're talking about here is important. The role of these as I described it with Frank Luntz, I think PR representatives for varying causes and how they operate here. And in the case of Finkelstein and Birnbaum, it's PR in the case of using or basically creating in a lot of ways and paving the way for perpetuation of this global narrative around George Soros that even people like Whitney Webb ultimately fit into when you think about Glenn Beck and the idea of the Great Resetting, Glenn Beck popularizing the Soros puppet master narrative at Fox News back during the early years of the Obama administration. That's right. This comes right back into like the whole Soros network is leading the way into this enslavement of the globe through this great reset to bring about global communism or whatever the final goal is. So it's all goes back to other things we've been discussing here. And basically these pollsters that are fancied as they're basically, I think, just PR operatives for these varying groups and narratives that are being put out there.
Yes, and obviously there is actually data collection happening. So they are not just doing PR operations. They do data collection, but the main point is that they do data collection not to just get some kind of objective viewpoint of reality, but then in order to engage information warfare.
Yeah.
All right.
The data is manipulated and in some cases is even influenced by like the types of operations that are going part, but definitely manipulated and taken advantage of.
So anytime you see this collection, and of course the name that was not involved in this last section was John McLaughlin, but the fact that you have Fabrizio coming out to sort of run the Paul Manafort sort of Russian connection side of it, but then you have McLaughlin coming out directly out of working with Netanyahu in Israel as Netanyahu's quote unquote pollster to work for the Trump campaign at the very similar time is very instructive of the larger aspects and configuration of the 11/9 operation and the Red Sea conspiracy component of it too, and how that then connects back to the Kremlin, and then of course these intense domestic elements too. All right, until next time, thank you very much, Greg.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, we appreciate everybody out there rocking with us. Until next time, Antidote, we are out.